Luis Ortega Govella is a Mexican architect and writer based in Los Angeles. He is a graduate of the Architectural Association in London and a founder of the arts collective AIR, whose work has been shown at the 2016 Berlin Biennial, the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and the 2014 and 16 Venice Architecture Biennale, to name a few spots. He is currently working on a documentary film and his first residential architecture project. Please come in. There's some chairs in the back if you want to. There's a little aisle way here. Okay. Yeah. Make yourself comfortable. Olivia Elangara, is that how you pronounce it?
Definitely.
Choreographs ultra-modern environments through installations, video, and writing that show how advanced technologies engender subjectivity. Alongside curating exhibitions as founding director of Grand Century in New York City, she has held solo exhibitions with Mother Culture Los Angeles, Human Resources Los Angeles, and now Dallas, Matthew, New York, What Pipeline, Detroit, Ballas Hertling, New York, and 17 Gallery in London. And she's been in many a group exhibition, but including the 14th Venice Architecture Biennale and at Lax Art and Ludlow 38, Canada Gallery, Brown University, and Capitol in San Francisco. So without further ado, let's bring these two up.
We're here to tell you about Garage, An American Delusion.
I'm Olivia, I'm an artist, and this book is really based on a shared interest in a often overlooked space, the garage, and it's really a conversation that takes place between us. So we're staging this as a conversation, and we're also, as we were writing the book Garage, we also started working on a documentary. So we'll be showing little clips of the doc throughout this. And without further ado...
Yeah, you might be asking yourself at this point what's so important about the garage, but I'm just going to say that's a stupid question.
So you want to take one, Mark?
I'm here to tell you the story of the garage.
I'm here to tell you the story of the garage.
So yes, what is a garage? Apart from being the space where Rose McGowan gets murdered in Scream, the garage is an architectural technology. It's an architectural technology that not only is sort of designed to house the car, but it's also an architectural technology that allows for the suburb to exist. It's through that space that basically land speculation can happen outside of city centers and mass means of transportation.
And we really talk about the garage as an image. As you just saw, it's an image in the American cultural conscious, and it's kind of a Duchampian ready-made fabrication, and it's become a space without rules or regulations. It's a free space within the home, and it's really the forgotten icon of the 20th century.
But so if this is sort of the technology that allows for suburbia to spread and for it to create suburbia, if you think about it, the suburbs are this very sort of, it's a residential zone, a purely residential zone that comes with a very sort of, a system of relationships that is very inherent to it. It's a heteronormative space, usually white, and it comes with sort of relations that are attached to it. So when you're inside it, identities are usually sort of encapsulated by sort of power relationships to a patriarchal system. So you're either the son, the mom, or the dad, and you sort of just inhabit them. But what's important and interesting for us is that the garage actually exists as a space where these identities can be contested and rethought. So it's sort of the space where it's almost like the closet for new identities to exist within suburbia.
We talk about it a lot as an incubator, which has, a relationship with the advent of Silicon Valley, which also in many ways that myth is related to the garage, as many startup, Hewlett-Packard, Apple, Disney, but then you also get into all of these other subcultures. And with Garage the book, we really start with a non-linear history. So in 1880, 75% of Americans were living in rural areas, and then industrialism happened. So local autonomies began living in cities, and we needed a way to connect the cities to the rural agricultural zones. And in this periphery, the suburbs emerge.
So in like with any sort of invention, and the space of the garage is this sort of space where all these sort of radical inventions have come from, we really wanted to sort of start from the beginning, and then it's what is the beginning of the garage? What is the invention of that space? Because it's something that we take for granted and it's banal, but it actually sort of has a beginning and an ending too, I would say. So it's 1908. It's the same year as Ford releases the Model T, which is the first sort of mass-produced car for in America, and it's also finally, you have this sort of machine that's kind of changing radically the way that you inhabit space and you can traverse space. So, but at the beginning, there's no sort of space for this car. No one knows what to deal with it, how to, integrate it into like a societal like sort of rhythm. So in comes Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright, which I think maybe most people in this room know, is an architect. But he was also super obsessed with cars. He like went bankrupt because he would collect all these cars. And he's sort of the first one that sees or so he claims, the car as this sort of object of radical change that could be integrated into the sort of domestic architecture. And he really sees... So the image is like so emblematic of what actually the car is doing, which is actually allowing for houses to exist outside of the home itself. It really takes the house outside of its confines.
And we even with Wright talk about his love of the machine. He's quoted as having said that we are at last face to face with the machine, the modern sphinx, whose riddle the artist must solve if he would that art live. For his nature holds the key. And it's within this obsession that he starts, like any architect, designing and imposing kind of his vision of this cyborg home, and that is the Roby House.
And yeah, so he's kind of esoteric. But the Roby House is sort of the beginning of attaching a garage to a home, is the first sort of prototype where this happens, and it's sort of famously known because it's the epitome of the prairie style, and the prairie style was Wright's sort of new definition of American vernacular. This is in Chicago, and he's sort of like leaving his job with Louis Sullivan, who's the father of the skyscraper. So Wright is really trying to sort of define himself as something that goes against that sort of tall extrusion, and he's really trying to do this sort of like low domestic architecture to define his own practice. And it's weird because he's proposing for this new like vernacular his lifestyle, and he's sort of really against all of let's say European Western constraints of home design, which at the time were sort of the prevalent way that like homes were being designed in America. So he's sort of trying to define this new American home, but in the process of sort of claiming that appropriation is wrong, he also starts appropriating Japanese sort of lifestyle.
But imagine how radical this home must have been when you're looking around at all of these homes with porticos, central entryways, columns, and all of a sudden, I mean, the neighbors thought that this was a brothel. It was so radical. And they literally could not process it as being a space that was safe for a family to be raised inside of.
So the Roby House is like famously known because it's sort of this, like the prototype of the prairie style, which in architectural folklore, it was because of that house that the Wasmuth portfolio was published, and it's sort of this folkloric tale that's how modernism started. I mean, obviously that's just like how white architects tried to describe like history happening. And that's a story that's been told many times before, but in the book, what we're trying to sort of posit is not the Roby House as this birthplace of modernism, but actually like the birthplace of what would become American suburbia. And it's really sort of in this household that Wright has this premonition of a digital age where like the human is beginning to be aided by machines. So again, like as Olivia was saying, we really kind of conceptualize this as like kind of a prototype for a cyborg house, the first sort of time that this is happening. And obviously like the main way that this happens is by Wright sort of trying to understand the best way to integrate the car within the domestic architecture of the time. And usually what happened at the time was that the stable was appropriated as a garage, and it was always sort of distance from the house. But that psychological and sort of physical distance from the machine allowed for it to sort of still be perceived as this object that didn't really affect life that much, but it was just used as a sort of like toy or like kind of tool that was sort of fun on the weekends. But what Wright does, which is kind of radical, is that he actually, this is a plan of the Robbie house, he actually places it in the front of the plot and as a main entrance. So if you think about it, like this is in Chicago in Woodland Avenue. So the main entrance of the house is here, which is hidden. And the front facade, which is this one, is sort of becomes the main entrance. The garage is sort of the thing that brings you in. So it's really like the first time that you start seeing the main entrance as the garage, which I think is super important because at the same time as Wright is sort of attaching this garage to the home, he's also prescribing for spaces like the front porch and the parlor to be removed from the house. And the front porch and the parlor were sort of these rooms that kind of were the spaces that basically brought the communality of the neighborhood into the house, because it was the sort of buffer zone between the privacy of the interior and the publicity of the street. And it was where you kind of would host these sort of neighborhood conversations. But Wright sort of fully sort of deletes it and doesn't have these spaces anymore. And I think it's sort of the first time that you can actually start thinking about how it is within this architecture that the hyper-individual starts getting formed, because it's not about the immediate context of the neighborhood and your connections to your neighbors, but actually it's about the unit of the family sort of containing itself and not being sort of explicit to the outside, actually hiding from the outside, and then having this machine or tool that connects the house to a larger context that is not the neighborhood. At the same time as he removes the front porch and the parlor, he also invents or thinks that he invents this living room. And the living room is sort of the first time also that you start seeing a deprogrammed room in a household. It's not a room that has any sort of programmatic constraints. It's just a space for the family to hang out. And what's sort of interesting to sort of notice is that both the garage, which is a 3-car garage with its own like car wash like machine attached to it, is that it's the same sort of scale. So you start seeing that the sort of the space for the family starts having the same amount of space as the space for the car or the machine.
And this is actually one of the first houses that had integrated technology. With the living room, right, you get the television. And so all of a sudden, the family, they might be congregating and spending time together in that space, but they're also being taken outside and seeing visions of a new world. And so it's not lost on us that the footprint is almost exactly equal between the space for the garage, which allowed for new forms of mobility through space and time, and that of the living room, which had the television, which allowed for surfing through channels and sort of being taken out into the world in a different way.
But what we had just told you is probably all lies. Like Frank Lloyd Wright, people get problematic when I just say Frank. He was a master manipulator of facts, and I think truth has become such a commodity. But with Wright, he's an architect. He does construction. So if you think about it, his first construction is himself, and this construction of himself is really one that's based on his power of self-mythologizing and sort of twisting things. Like he's famously known for like erasing all the dates on his plans to claim that they were done earlier than they were actually done. He changed his birth date to sound younger than he actually was. So it's part his claim that he was the inventor of the attached garage, but also part maybe reality. So it's interesting because it's something that in our project is what we're interested in. Is not so much the factual, historical like sort of thing, but it's actually how the folklore of a story is what creates the reality that we all inhabit.
And that's how we ended up with a book without any footnotes, which is something that ultimately critics have tried to, claim that it is somehow taking away from the argument, but it was completely intentional. I mean, it's programmed within the space of the garage to distort reality. It's completely one of the, it's part of the psychology of not only the person who claims that they invented it, but all of the subjectivities that go on to hack into the use of the garage or misuse the garage. Those people all are erasing their past to invent a new future. So it was very much intentional. And yeah, I think it's an important thing kind of to note that also throughout the documentary, we're constantly diving back into this twisting of fact and fiction.
So Wright built this house in 1908, and it obviously becomes this like, sort of prototype of what a suburban home should be because the car is sort of attached to it, but it also sort of starts defining this new American family and a new model of like living that sort of then gets appropriated. So we're sort of fast forwarding to the 1950s post-war suburban sort of expansion when America was seduced by suburbia.
And within this time, this is right, like during the Great Depression and after Roosevelt had turned houses into commodities, and this was to incentivize construction and home ownership, and also low interest rate mortgages. So car lobbyists were really important and instrumental to the creation of the suburbs in that they created propaganda against like the urban row house, and they promised that suburbanization was the answer to the American dream.
You don't have anything
First
later,
line
do
is
you?
car manufacturers lobbied to make sure that the FHA only gave out
It's the
mortgages to
hardness.
houses with attached.
Suburbia was not designed for me.
Or me.
Or us.
The FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, created low-interest mortgages.
Car manufacturers made sure that the FHA only gave mortgages to houses with attached garages.
But not just anyone could get these mortgages.
These contracts were made available only to white soldiers.
Until the 1960s, racially restrictive deed covenants were still legal.
A racially restrictive deed covenant works exactly how it sounds.
The practice is called redlining, and it's how we created white suburbia.
In suburbia, all work was women's work.
Suburbia itself was built on the backs of women who cooked, cleaned, and cared for both man and child. This exploitation of motherhood and domestic servitude was Freud's only teat.
So that's another small clip from the doc where, again, if the book is tracing like a non-linear history of the garage, then the documentary is focusing not only on real people within the space of the garage, but also taking on this educational form where we can kind of create, fictional environments and distill the information within the book. And what we just went over was the practice of redlining, which was when, this is after the New Deal, but the government took a red pen to maps and they would literally circle outlines where people of color would live, and they would deem those unsafe for mortgages. And so that's how we ended up with this sort of white flight and these little bubbles of suburbia as a white enclave.
And that's really sort of the impetus behind the project and why Olivia and I sort of wanted to tackle the garage from the very beginning, because it's sort of my identity as a Mexican and gay who is like sort of an identity that is meant to exist outside of those constructs of suburban construct is exactly, I think, the focus of what the project is trying to achieve is sort of bring light to how actually within the garage new identities are forming that are contesting that very traditional sort of sense of how you think conceptualize the suburbs to exist. And which brings us to sort of the main aspect or the main sort of interest that behind, or architecturally speaking, of the space, which is the fact that the garage was designed to fulfill a specific function, which was to house the car, but that function is a function that sort of only happens for maybe overnight or a couple of hours a day. Sometimes it doesn't even happen, so it really becomes this room, an oversized room that doesn't have any function, and this only sort of is achieved when the car was weatherized so it could actually be kept outside. And that is sort of like an interesting thing to think about when you sort of have the overbearing, overprescribed rooms of the household where like the bedroom is sort of this space for reproduction, for the monogamous relationship to like exist, where you have the kitchen where you're sort of enslaved to the oven and cooking, and where you have the living room with the TV sort of like the thing that is sort of taking power over that room. The garage without the car becomes this empty frame upon which like an identity can actually go in and start defining a new sort of space that goes against the purely residential zone of the suburb.
And in many ways, the garage, at least when people have spoken to us about the project, is still a gendered space. People still think of it as prototypically masculine because of the relationship to the machine. And you think of, Kevin Spacey in American Beauty, sort of experimenting with his macho nature and masculinity, but also, maybe there's this like long love affair, queer narrative happening on the sidelines.
Well, the thing with Kevin Spacey also in that film is that he's playing the same character, like he's trying to sleep with a teenager. So it's like, well, the whole plot of the film is that he's doing the same thing the way he was accused last year. So it's like this weird, like, yeah.
Moving out of the gossip, let's just take it back to the book.
That's in the book.
No, it is actually. We do drag Kevin Spacey a little bit, but the garage really, once it's deprogrammed, becomes a space of beyond just invention in terms of this narrative of like tech entrepreneurship, but a space of artistic creation. And so it becomes a studio for artists. William Wegman had a studio in Venice where he would do his magical work. And we cover in the book Fabio Sargentini, Latico.
Latico, which was this gallery that opened in '68, and it was sort of, it's in a garage, but it's also the first time that there's art being produced for a space that's not a domestic gallery, which was the sort of prevalent condition in Rome at the time. So it really shifted art production, and Arte Povera was basically founded because Fabio Sargentini decides to move his gallery into a garage. So it's a space that has had the power to sort of contest and change the domestic in a way that sort of we have delineated in the book, but it's also a space that kind of leads us to the production of like American companies.
Mattel, for instance, they claim that Ruth Handler founded Mattel in her garage, and so that's another way in which this gendered space kind of fractures, where you get this idea of like mechanized femininity. But Barbie actually, they claim that it was replicating the Fordist line of production. So you go back to this earlier version of how cars were produced. And ultimately, within the deprogrammed space, this is really where I think where we're all living today. And that's where most of the subjectivities and the people who we explore in our documentary really lie. And so we'll show you a little montage of a few of the subjects.
Every club started as a family. There was a war going on, and by '83, it was really bad, so my mom sent us over here. Once we get to the border, they just told us to walk like 2 blocks, and then we got into a car.
I'm Franklin Bell, and I was thinking about people need a little joy, a little extra in life, and I came up with the idea of the workshop. We're not using the whole garage, you know that.
My name's Jeff Ho. I started building skateboards in the 50s, surfboards in the 60s, and the garage was one of my places that I started out when I was a young kid.
The garage is the id of the home.
The garage is now a temple to the self.
So
Oh, we have to save that for the end. It's the best part.
So it's really like this incubator of subculture and new ways of being, and actually like the thing that I think we're really sort of concentrating on is, and maybe the thing that we have, the elephant in the room, is that as much as it is this positive thing for subculture, it's also the startup garage myth, which is sort of why...
Great thing for capital.
But it's really a blueprint that a lot of sort of American companies have attached themselves to as a beginning story, as this like mythos of sort of a humble beginning. It kind of what I'm going to concentrate on is the Hewlett-Packard one, which was basically considered the birthplace of Silicon Valley. But what's interesting about Hewlett-Packard is that their first client was Walt Disney, who also started in a garage in California, and he hired them to basically create the audio oscillator, which was the first prototype for like the surround system. And so that sort of is the beginning of Silicon Valley with that Hewlett-Packard garage. And then Steve Jobs and Wozniak, who were both interns at Hewlett-Packard during their teens, also kind of capitalized on this notion of the garage and start Apple and in a garage in Palo Alto, which then sort of spurs out into Google, Amazon, and all these like sort of companies like fully appropriating that story as part of their blueprint.
It's really the perfect point of branding. And the garage just becomes a way to get the right investors. And it's sort of emblematic of this tech entrepreneurship, but also
everyday like American sort of coming out with like this genius
aspiration.
idea.
Exactly.
Which is obviously, as we have delineated in the history, it's not the reality because the Federal Housing Association was like sort of really protecting the suburb and the garage, which people could like get a garage. So it's not really this everyday American that sort of has access to that space, but it is presented back as this branding of like
the everyday
a humble like start. But what's radical about the garage is that actually the personal computer was allegedly invented inside that space.
But allegedly would be the key word, as this is a story of lies, potentially. But Steve Jobs was known for his ability to distort reality. His employees would call it reality distortion field, which is actually a word from a Star Trek episode where aliens use mental force to convince a civilization to believe in them. And so Jobs also had this ability, and he claims that he started Apple in a garage, but this is something that Wozniak is constantly contesting and saying it's a lie.
But it's an interesting story because it's also the way that we sort of fully go into a conspiracy theory where Jobs has a really direct connection to Frank Lloyd Wright, and that's through Eichler. Eichler was a California developer who in the 1950s started built 12,000 homes in the Bay Area, and it was inside one of these homes that Steve Jobs claimed that he invented the personal computer with Steve Wozniak. That's sort of a fabrication because the reality of that thing that he sort of said to Walter Isaacson in his biography where he goes like, oh, it's an Eichler. It actually turns out that he didn't grow up in an Eichler. He grew up in something that was similar to an Eichler, but he just like sort of fully twisted history to be able to like sort of put himself in between Eichler and Wright.
And Eichler, it's interesting to note, he was previously working in large-scale food distribution, so he applied that system onto home design. So it was the first time that people weren't just building homes individually, but they were building them in huge swaths by the hundreds, inventing what we understand to be like the California suburb today, and Palo Alto specifically.
But what's interesting about Eichler is that he's not like a typical suburban developer. What he's trying to sort of integrate is modernism into the masses. So he's really, and it all starts when he moves into the Hanna House, which is a house that Frank Lloyd Wright designed after the Prairie Style in 1938, I think. And he sort of moves there for 3 years, and that's when he decides to leave his job as a food manufacturing distribution person and start sort of developing this prefabricated housing construction based on the same models that Wright had. And it is in one of these houses that Wozniak, who was the actual inventor of the personal computer, that he starts doing this. But Wright, as much as he invented the attached garage, he also starts inventing the carport, which is the technology that allows for the car to stay outside but without the enclosure of the garage. But what's interesting with Eichler is that because the Federal Housing Association wouldn't give out mortgages to houses with attached garages, he both integrates carport and garage, which means that he basically makes the garage a redundant room by design, because you basically have a place to put your car that's outside of the garage next to it, which makes it into an empty place where people can actually occupy it for whatever they want.
And this brings us to garagification, which is a term that we invented for this thesis, for this project. And it's really this idea of how reality distortion field and the ways in which both Jobs and Wright are able to get people into an ecstatic, excitement about a future not yet designed, but that you can really transform space, and any user can kind of enter into a garage or an empty room and change its use function. And so within that term, garagification, that's also where the personal computer and the smartphone really reside.
And it's sort of within those tools that sort of come out of the garage that actually we start conceptualizing the city not as a space of rooms, but actually as a space of garages where you have the sort of technology and the ability to turn every single space that you go into like your little studio garage space. So it's this really interesting thing, but it's not only about that ability to transform space through like technology, but it's actually like, I think it comes with a very strong aesthetic force. Like if you think about it, the garage sort of places itself in between the place of work or the office and the place of the house. So it's this hybrid room where work is basically reintroduced into the home and the home is reintroduced into work. And then you can see it in the contemporary office landscape how this is sort of operating as a level of like a layer of domestic comfort. You think about like, this like industrial shabby chic like thing that people do in the Googleplex, but also it comes with the beanbag. It comes with this sort of like notion of comfort and domestic like layering, wallpaper, let's call it, that actually ultimately is just for more productivity.
And it essentially erodes the separation between home and office and work and leisure. So as much as the garage does have this positive force for, being hacked into by different identities to construct new alternatives to like a heteronormative space, but it's also potentially a cage where we can't stop working and we're sort of ceaselessly in this space of labor. And that brings us
to American Delusion, which is sort of, again, an idea that comes from the fact that if the garage operates as this multi-purpose room where like the uses of it sort of keep growing and keep sort of expanding, if you sort of conceptualize that to identities, you can sort of see today that the sort of typical American person, or I think people in general, there is a notion that identities are not just singular. They're like, you have to carry with you this sort of plethora of identities that you have to tap into depending on what you're sort of operating or sort of trying to do. Like right now I'm operating as a talker, but I'm also an architect, but I'm also this Mexican person. Like it's a lot of different things to like sort of contain within oneself. And it's obviously, I think, a delusional state of mind, because what we sort of have encountered throughout the documentary is that a lot of these new identities that are emerging in the landscape are inhabiting old typologies built for traditional family structures, but they're sort of molding them for this new like uses. But it's a disconnect because you're sort of trying to reinvent a way of being or a lifestyle, but without the architecture to come with it. So you're sort of just constantly being oppressed by this suburban home that the people that at least we've been talking to have to constantly try to make and work for themselves.
There's one thing, though, that I do think like every person that we've interviewed for both the book and the documentary really is doing, and that is they're creating new familial structures. So they may be contained and having friction within the space that they're operating within, but the garage presents an outlet within which they can really, explode the nuclear family.
Yeah, it's really a space where, like, I think new families are being created, new family structures are being created.
Well, speaking of garage, how about the garage we had at your dad's place? They came down and caught us.
That's not supposed to be talked about.
I know.
Yeah. There's been many a child, I should say, conceived in a garage.
Well, it's not about the history of the garage. It always be a part of you.
Yep, and it's endless.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, would you prefer to do questions over there, or do you want to take a couple?
We'll take a couple and
Yeah,
then we
of
can
course.
continue questions like over there with some drinks.
Yeah, with a drink. Yes.
Oh, should I use the mic? Okay. So I was struck anew, this wasn't the first time, that Frank Lloyd Wright, great maverick, had planted the seed of American conformity. Frank Lloyd Wright, Howard Roark, ends up creating, in effect, this heterogeneous, this homogeneous American culture. So my question is, did you look into the garage as a site of suicide? Because there's a very specific form of suicide that can just about only take place in the garage, namely having the doors shut, turning on the motor, and then you die of carbon monoxide poisoning.
It's really funny. Every single time we talk about the garage, the first question that everyone asks us is about the suicide that happens inside it.
Yeah. Well, we actually in the book take a lighter angle on it in that we address suicide, but we do it by talking about the film Virgin Suicides, where it was a film by Sofia Coppola that came out probably a decade ago. But one of the young girls, and this takes place in the 60s and 70s, but she commits suicide through carbon monoxide poisoning. And it's really within our discussion, I mean, I think it's, again, this idea of suicide, right, is sort of a last resort, and it's potentially coming out of a feeling of not being able to escape whatever your reality is. And so as much as the garage offers a lot of potential for new and divergent uses, it is also emblematic and very much related to, again, this sort of stifling homogeneous reality.
Yeah, I mean, we also talk about Nirvana, about Kurt Cobain's suicide in the book, because Nirvana sort of started in a garage too. But I mean, I think the main thing about it is that what we consider the garage to be is this space where you sort of create new identities, and to create those new identities, a lot of the thing that has to happen is sort of this destruction of a previous self. Like, you can't, it comes with a sort of, to become the punk teenager, you have to get rid of a little bit of the son condition that you have embedded into that identity. So it does, this reinvention of the self does happen through a destruction of a previous self, which I guess sometimes it could be taken to its ultimate sort of condition, which is suicide. But I mean, it also comes down to the architecture of the space, which is
it's a room
the biggest
without
room
ventilation.
and there's no windows.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a space to escape from the schadenfreude of the neighborhood. So it's obviously the space where you can actually go in and do the things that are sort of not allowed to happen in the glazing of the house.
I would also say it's a temple to the self, and in, again, its most radical form. An ending really could be a beginning, but that radical self and the radical individual that you brought up in Howard Roark and Ayn Rand in Fountainhead, because she wrote Roark after the figure of Wright, like that's someone who was unyielding in their integrity in a way that didn't allow them to really function in a real world. And so there is a big relationship, I think, to suicide, but it's, in a sense, the way that endings always beget beginnings.
Thank you for your presentation. I won't look at a garage the same ever again. So what I'm trying to organize my thoughts, but in terms of where you end, your entire thesis and the examples you give seem to be based on actions in garages. But what about our society moving to just having too much stuff, and the garage now being the storage? So action versus inaction. So now the garage is a place for inaction, for places to store things and objects and not cars anymore. And I think when the garage started, maybe there were no closets. I mean, now we have to put closets into the cars, so the garage is like a closet for stuff.
It's funny that you mentioned that when garage started there were more closets. It's interesting because when you look at the Robbie house, Wright is at the same time waging a war against housewives, and he's sort of decreeing that every single home should have less closets than they actually had before. So he, as much as he's deleting the porch in the front and the parlor, he's also sort of removing as many closet spaces as he can from the home. And it's interesting because it's obviously the futility of architecture, sort of, you can see it in that history, because he's sort of, by removing the spaces but then introducing the garage, but then 50 years later becomes the biggest closet in the room. Is sort of like life always finds itself back into what the architect is trying to sort of cleanse. But yeah, hoarders. I don't know.
Yeah, we talk about hoarders and Y2K and this idea of, consumptive practices, basically, that paranoia can lead to people really needing to just have too much in their lives, or even Marie Kondo, this idea of like get rid of more and more, and you see these garages that really have become almost like repositories. They're archives for nostalgia. They're where like old toys live, where the kids, baseball bats and mitts are, but the kids grew up 20 years ago and nobody's cleaned. And so in a weird way, we really do refer to the garage as a part of the psychology of the family, and it's the id of the home. It really becomes the place in which all of this refuse, be it like physical or psychological, ends up being stored.
One more, I think. Sorry.
So have you looked at the evolution of the garage in terms of the original carriage house? And that idea about the carriage house, but also in your journey, were you also looking at the industrial revolution and industrialization and how that conformed work, and that you mentioned that people are always working, but in fact what they were doing was recreating a slice of those work environments, vis-a-vis a workstation, in the laboratories, on the manufacturing floors, and places like that.
It's interesting because the garage is a Fordist, a space created by Fordism. So but it's also a space that creates a zone which is purely residential, that is meant to keep out any industry or work from happening inside the suburb, because that was the whole purpose of a suburb, was no work to be penetrating this zone, because that was the only way that you could have like a safe investment exist, or make homes into commodities that you could actually trade beyond just ownership. So it's really funny because I think in the history of the garage you can really see the collapse of that model, that structural model which is Fordism, and then going to this post-Fordist sort of moment, but then also the introduction of the digital age. So I think it's interesting because I think, yes, by looking at that space you can sort of see the kind of cornerstones of those moments that these things shift and these things sort of start becoming it always makes me sad, because I feel like there were moments when there were times when the garage actually could contest the larger sort of structure that was around it, and there was actually operative and working well, because it was sort of decreeing that this sort of industrial labor was not right, and then it was sort of decreeing that this personal labor should be okay. But it was always just re-embraced again, and it's this impossibility of carving an outside, which the garage sort of, that's the whole sort of psychology behind occupying the garage, that you're carving an outside from your reality, from the reality that surrounds you. But ultimately what ends up cyclically happening is that you just are reinforcing that structure around you rather than like actually dismantling it. So I don't like talking about it too much because it makes me sad.
One last thing, I guess, to close out on the real conspiracy of the garage is this idea of a carriage house, right? That would be a stable, essentially, right? A place for your horse. And what is the stable but the birthplace of Christianity in many ways, the manger. So ultimately this book is about the beginning of monotheism and how it's enforced labor into the home.
It is all about the individual.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's give a round of applause for that ending.